We return here to discuss the Algeria, the settler colony in Algeria. And we talked in our last about the effort to finally conquer Algeria. It took 20 years to do that. I mentioned Abd al-Qadir, and here's a picture of him, leader of the Algerian resistance to French colonialism, a picture of him at the surrender where he hands over his sword to the French military. From the start, France's principal strategy in the colonization of Algeria was sending settlers to Algeria. To this end, from the beginning, the French pursued a strategy particularly destructive to the nomadic tribes of Algeria. By the right of conquest, by what the French called the right of conquest, the French seized as much empty space as they could. And of course, when you're dealing with a pastoral people, and this same thing is true in the United States, in present-day United States, the way that the Native Americans operated was they would move from place to place over the course of a year. And they would compel the Indian tribes, as the French compelled the Algerian tribes, into a small fraction of what had been formerly their total land base. But the culture of these people required the total land base for their sustenance. They used all of it, just not all at the same time. And so the French forced these people, as the Americans did as well, the Europeans who arrived in the United States did as well, into a fraction of their former territory. And the more time the French were there, the more that fraction was the most infertile or arid zones, the driest zones, the zones least hospitable to either growing crops or grazing animals. Sometimes a given tribe's entire land was seized and the tribe was forced into the empty space of a neighboring tribe. When the Algerians resisted this colonization, the resistance itself was used as a pretext for seizing still more land. For example, in 1871, an insurrection against French rule began, and the French, in response, declared that tribes with any members who participated in the rebellion would have to take, quote-unquote, collective responsibility for the insurrection. So even a single person in a given tribe participates in the rebellion against the French, the whole tribe is penalized. The insurrection, a single person might cause the loss of 1/5 of the land base of the entire tribe. As a result, in one single Algerian province, 181 tribes, about a little less than a third of all the tribes in Algeria, were fined 30 million francs and had over 500,000 hectares of land seized from them. The Governor General acknowledged that these were heavy fines, that these fines constituted 70% of the total wealth of these tribes. But he celebrated because such heavy fines would require that the tribes sell off still more land. The most powerful means that the Europeans used, that the French used in this effort to depose the Algerians of their land, involved imposing a European legal system upon the Algerians. And the essential element of that European legal system, private property. In 1863, French colonial authorities passed a law breaking up the tribes into smaller units, tying these smaller units into specific areas and allocating individual plots to particular families. Subsequent French colonial rule allowed for the sale of these individual plots. Initially, this 1863 law, the French justified this 1863 law as supposedly protecting the Algerians from losing their land to the colons, because we're giving this land, we're making it private property, we're giving it to you. It's going to protect that land from the acquisition by the colons of that land. Subsequent laws dispensed with the pretense and stated explicitly that their goal was to make it easier for the colons to get the land. One Algerian understood full well the significance of these laws. The French, said he, have defeated us in the plain of Spica and killed our young men. We're talking about the wars and the suppression of the rebellions against French rule. They have imposed war indemnities upon us. They fined us for participating in these rebellions. All this is nothing. Wounds can heal, he says. But the establishment of individual property rights and the power given to each person to sell lands which will be allocated as their share, this is the death sentence of the tribe. Why is that? Why is private control of the land, private property in land, the death sentence of the tribe? Because this man knows full well that the conditions that the French impose on these tribal members are such that they can't last long on the land. The land can't sustain them. The land that they have can't sustain them as an individual family. And that given that, over a period of time, they will have to sell the land in order to survive. And this particular Algerian says within 20 years, the tribes will be history. Passage to a money economy and taxes in money made this effective. If you're going to tax people in money, they don't have enough, they don't have a mechanism for raising cash possible by selling one's individual allotment. Now, of course, under the Ottoman Empire, there had been taxes too, but these taxes were taxes in kind. And again, if a harvest was bad in a particular year, if things went against people for one reason or another, that was taken into account in the taxation. But the French, cash money, we don't care your circumstances, you give it to us. One historian put it this way: the peasants and pastoralists forced by French policy into a much reduced area of the arid, infertile, and hilly land, hit by fines and sequestrations for acts of rebellion, and subject to heavy taxes paid in coin, were reduced to a level of poverty and hunger that forced them into increasing debt. However, loans were generally made by lenders at almost extortionate rates and trapped small borrowers into a further cycle of indebtedness. In desperation, peasants were forced to mortgage or sell their most precious asset, the land itself. This is taken from the reading I've given you that you were supposed to have done for this week. During the last 20 years of the 19th century, the Algerians lost fully 1/4 of their land due to this French policy. And land in the hands of the French colonists doubled from about 1.25 million acres to 2.5 million hectares of land. By the early 20th century, fully 60% of Algeria's population, peasants, the Algerians, were confined to land that could not yield a bare subsistence for those people. Unable to make ends meet on this inadequate land base, more and more peasants were compelled to sell their land and work as sharecroppers for the European settlers. So just as in South Africa, just as in the United States, these small French farmers without significant capital are still able to make a go of it by using Algerians on land that used to be owned by the Algerians themselves and putting those Algerians into the position of a sharecropper whose debts grow year by year even as the French colon enriches himself. As McMaster argues, McMaster, the author I've given you to look at for this week, argues overall then, the long-term destructive impact of colonialism on Algerian society created those conditions which dislodged pastoralists and peasants from the all-embracing structures of the traditional socioeconomic order and ultimately made them available as a source of labor to the settlers. As in so many other colonial contexts in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, the object in seizing huge areas of native territory was not only to gain unimpeded access to the land for farming and mining, but also to destroy the traditional subsistence base of the natives so that they would be compelled to offer their labor power to the colons. And with that, I will conclude this discussion today, and we will pick up in our next with a closer look at the colons in Algeria.